Revelation chapter 20 essentially consists of two main sections. Verses 1 through 6, which we dealt with in the last lecture, deal with events occurring before the second coming of Christ. Then Revelation 7 through 15, Revelation 20 verses 7 through 15, deal with events in conjunction with the second coming of Christ. And that's what we'll be dealing with here. Further, as we said, Revelation 20, particularly the first 10 verses in any event, largely deal with Satan, the effect of the first coming of Christ with respect to Satan's power and the scope of his activities. So we talked in the last lecture about the so-called binding of Satan, which is not a physical binding, but it is telling us that he was bound so that he would not deceive the nations anymore, which means his power was restricted at the first coming of Christ so that he could not prevent the spread of the gospel to people of every tribe, tongue, and nation in the entire world, which had been the case before Christ came, and also until he is loosed from his restrictions, which we will talk about, he has not been able to lead a concerted, systematic, organized effort of the entire world to destroy the church. But now we will pick up in verse 7 with the events connected with the second coming of Christ. Remember, at the end of verse 3, it talked about how he was going to be restricted so that he could not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. Verse 7 picks up that thought. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand on the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Now, you recall, I had given a few reasons in the last lecture why we know Revelation 20 does not pick up chronologically where Revelation 19 left off, but it goes back to the first coming, and then, as the other major sections of Revelation do, and then continues through to the second coming and the judgment. We saw, for example, that at the end of Revelation 19, the nations had all been destroyed, everyone was killed, and the language of that final battle is all comprehensive because it talks about everyone, small and great, slave or free, are those who will be devoured. So there were no nations, yet Satan was bound so that he could not deceive the nations. So obviously that binding had to occur before the events at the end of Revelation 19. Now, in Revelation 20, verse 8, it talks about how Satan will come out to deceive the nations, which are in the four corners of the earth, to gather them together for the war. And that phrase, I think, is significant because Revelation 16, beginning at verse 14, Revelation 19, verse 19, it all talked about the war. Revelation 16, verse 14 said that the demons go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great God, the Almighty. Revelation 19, verse 19, I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assemble to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. And now, in 20, verse 8, it talks about Satan gathering people from the nations from the four corners of the earth for the war. Now, this is telling us two things. First, the use of the definite article, the, suggests that this battle represents the final and conclusive defeat of Christ's enemies. And it is what is known as the article of previous reference. What does that mean? That tells us that John is referring to something that he's already spoken about. Now, that can only be the battle or war referred to at the end of chapter 16 and at the end of chapter 19. Both in chapter 16 and in chapter 19, the battle or war takes place in association with Christ's second coming. The exact same thing happens here. And chapter 16, verse 14, 19, verse 19, and 20, verse 8 are the only uses of the Greek word polemos, battle or war, accompanied by the article the in Revelation, which is a firm indication that Revelation 20, verse 8 is repeating the previous accounts of this great battle at the end of history, which means, and before the second coming. So again, this means that the binding had to be now, before the second coming. Furthermore, the fact is that we've said that Revelation is progressively parallel. And we see that in chapter 20 as well, because in chapter 16, it talked about the demons had gathered, the spirits of demons went out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war. Well, now, in chapter 20, verse 8, we see in 7 and 8, it is Satan himself that comes to deceive the nations to gather them for war. So just as we saw earlier that Satan was the power behind the throne with respect to Babylon the Great and the Beast, so we see that Satan is the power behind the throne to gather the nations and organize them for this battle or war. So I mentioned, I believe in the last lecture also, that in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 26 says that, 25 and 26 say that Christ must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death. Well, here in verse 10, we see the devil, in verse 9, they came up on the broad plain of the earth, surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. Fire came down from heaven and devoured them. Now, again, the last enemy is death. That cannot possibly, so therefore these events, the loosing of Satan and then his destruction along with all of the people who he has gathered for war, has to be at the time of Christ's second coming. Why do we know that? Well, we know that, and let me just tell you, in our book on biblical eschatology, particularly in chapter 5, the eschatological significance of the second coming of Christ, and in Appendix 2, where I put this all together, we discuss all of these matters in great detail. But I had quoted from 1 Corinthians 15, verse 26, which says that the last enemy to be abolished is death. Then at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, he describes the consummation. In verse 50, he says that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. He then states in verse 53 that when the perishable will put on imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. That occurs, according to verse 52, at the last trumpet, when the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. Verse 54 goes on to say, in 1 Corinthians 15, that When this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Now, the clear temporal reference to the events of verse 54, death being swallowed up in victory, and the dead being raised, that is to the second coming of Christ. That's what that whole chapter, beginning in verse 26, is all about. And so, in chapter 15, verse 24, the end is coterminous with the abolition of death, which is when our bodies are changed and put on immortality. All of those things occur at the coming of Christ, which means, of course, that since chapter 20 is has to be recapitulating chapter 19, and therefore the second coming has to occur after, not before, the 1,000 years. So, in other words, what we see here is that Satan is loosed. He gathers the world together against the church, but he is destroyed when fire comes down from heaven. Now, the reference to Gog and Magog in verse 8, that goes back to Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. And again, this is talking about a battle involving the world and so on, the orchestration of events by God, and it is the eschatological final crisis and conflict. Now, so again, what John is doing is he's using events, symbols, and passages from the Old Testament here in the book of Revelation. Now, one thing I said in an earlier lecture, that the judgment which occurs in connection with the second coming of Christ is frequently spoken of both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and here in Revelation, as both a battle and a war. Both as a battle or war and as a courtroom proceeding. Now, fire coming down from heaven, corresponds with the battle as talked about in Revelation 16 and at the end of Revelation 19. Now, it is probably natural for us to think of the events of Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10, the fire coming down and so on, as being a physical battle or war between Satan and his followers and the church. And there is some indication or substantiation for that in Matthew 24, verse 22, which says, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of those of the elect, the days will be cut short. But that is actually probably not the focus of the passage, because we need to remember that our primary battle against Satan and his followers is not physical. It's not a battle of guns and tanks and airplanes and swords or so on. It is spiritual. And the battle for Christianity is not fought with the carnal sword. It's the battle between the true gospel and the false gospel, a battle of truth against error. And it is a battle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and spiritual wickedness in high places, according to Ephesians 6. Now, as we said, there undoubtedly will be persecution, but remember that what Jesus said in Luke 18 was, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? And remember, he defeats his enemies by the sword that comes out of his mouth, which is the word of God. And so we need to remember, we said John's main points are spiritual. So we need to be very careful when we look at this as simply a physical battle or war. Further, fire, as we've said, fire coming down from heaven is always a sign of God's judgment. And consequently, in Revelation 20, verses 9 and 10, God's dramatically terminating this battle may in fact be figurative or symbolic of the final judgment itself. Because remember, the judgment is described as a battle and as a courtroom proceeding. We tend to separate them, whereas I think this may simply be symbolic language that is talking about the judgment itself. Now, in verse 10, there is, at the end of verse 19, at the end of chapter 19, verse 20, it said, "The beast was seized, and with him the false prophet, who performed signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast. And these were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone." Now, in chapter 20, verse 10, it says, "Fire comes down from heaven, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and false prophet are also. And they'll be tormented day and night forever and ever." Many, many people think that the beast and the false prophet were thrown into the lake of fire 1,000 years before Satan is. Again, that is not correct, because chapter 20 here, verses 7 through 10, is recapitulating what is said at the end of chapter 19 concerning this final battle. In fact, the beast, the false prophet, and Satan are all thrown into the lake of fire at the same time. And we even see that in the language that verse 10 uses. Because what verse 10 actually says is that the beast, that the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where both the beast and the false prophet. But it does not contain a verb. It has an ellipsis. If you're writing it, there are 3 dots there. So what it actually says is, the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And so that ellipsis, the lack of a verb, requires the translator to supply one. And now, most translators supply where the beast and the false prophet were or are. My Bible says where the beast and the false prophet are also. And that is implying that these judgments are sequential and not synonymous. But the ellipsis in this particular form, and I talk about this in the book, is a very rare thing. The most common form of ellipsis would be the omission of the with the verb. And therefore, it should read, "The devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet were thrown," because that is what the prior verb would say. And so, in other words, they're all thrown in at the same time. And it is not saying that the beast and the false prophet were thrown in 1,000 years earlier than the devil is thrown in. These are all things that are indicating the judgment. But then we have a different picture of the judgment in verses 11 through 15. Because in verses 11 through 15, we then see the judgment not as battle or war, but as a courtroom proceeding. Verse 11, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them." Let me just pause there for a moment. Remember, we had seen in chapter 6 and in chapter 16 how every mountain and island was cast out of its place, and the earth, the world could not be found. Same type of imagery is using here. Therefore, again, this judgment is occurring in connection with the second coming of Christ. Those statements in chapter 6, chapter 16, and here are all talking about the same event. Progressively parallel description of the Bible, use here in Revelation. And what now is going on, and I mentioned earlier that the oftentimes what John does here in Revelation is that he gives more detail here in these later chapters of things that had only been announced in the earlier chapters. And so it says that so for example, back in chapter 11, verse 18, again, it was talking about the second coming and the judgment. It says, 11 verse 18, the nations were enraged, your wrath has come, and the time came for the dead to be judged, and the time to reward your bondservants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, the small and the great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth. So back in chapter 11, it said the time has come to be judged, but it didn't really give a great description of it. Now we have the description both as a battle in verses 7 through 10, but now as a court proceeding in chapter 11 or chapter 20 verses 11 through 15. So he goes on to say, I saw the dead, verse 12, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and the books were open, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one of them according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Now, here in these verses, we said that it says in verse 14, death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. That corresponds to what I mentioned earlier in 1 Corinthians 15, that the last enemy to be abolished is death. So Christ's coming brings with it judgment and the abolition of death, because now death and Hades is thrown into the lake of fire, which is the second death. Now, who's being judged here? Some people think that there are multiple judgments. They separate this judgment from the judgment seat of Christ, which is mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I think that's incorrect. Here, Christ's great white throne in verse 11 is his judgment seat, because everyone, the small and the great, are standing before the throne, and they're being judged from the books. This is the judgment that will take place. And now, what is the nature of this judgment? I mean, because, again, and I've talked about this before. We mention it in chapter 5 concerning the second coming of Christ in our book on biblical eschatology. But all across the New Testament, it says that there will be a great general judgment of everybody, believers and unbelievers alike, when Christ comes again. He says, Jesus said, that is when the sheep will be separated from the goats. In Matthew 13, he said, that is when the wheat will be separated from the tares. These are not separate judgments, one for sheep and one for goats, or one for wheat and one for tares. No, it is one judgment in which there will be separation. What's the nature of the judgment? Both verse 12 and verse 13 both say that they will be judged according to their deeds. Now, we can't earn our way to heaven by doing good deeds. But as African scholar Onesimus Ngundu says, works, our deeds, are an index of the spiritual condition of a person's heart. The judgment will reveal whether or not people's loyalties have been with God and the Lamb or with God's enemies. And so I mentioned the sheep and the goats, and I think I mentioned it in the last lecture, Matthew 25. And that judgment says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, namely at the second coming, then everyone stands before him, and he doesn't just ask, did you receive me as your Lord and Savior? No. He looks at our life, our whole life. Jesus said elsewhere, what is said in secret will be shouted from the rooftops. What's done, hidden will be revealed. And so, did you clothe me when I was naked? Did you feed me when I was hungry? Did you visit me when I was sick and in prison? Did you take me in when I was a stranger? Because how we treat the least of these shows what we really think of Christ. Why? Because every human being has been made in the image of God, and how we treat God's image shows what we really think of him. Jesus is not fooled by our words. He looks to our whole life to reveal whether or not the words we say are true or false. And so what is going on here is that the judgment will be true. And notice it says that everyone will stand before him, the great and the small. Notice that there are no distinctions here. It is just all people of any kind here are going to be judged. And so I think that, it's not talking about the great and the small among believers or unbelievers. I think this is a general description of the great general judgment of all mankind, which will be brought about in connection with the second coming of Christ. And so what we have here in Revelation chapter 20, it goes back, like the other major sections of the book. It begins with the events in connection with the first coming of Christ, which involved the so-called binding of Satan. And Jesus had said, God, how can you plunder a man's house unless you bind the strong man? Revelation 12 talked about, in connection with what Christ did on the cross, Satan being cast to the earth. Different imagery here, but same kind of idea. Satan is bound, or you might say restricted now. But and God's people are sitting in the heavenly places now, verses 4 through 6. But there's a distinction between the first resurrection and the second resurrection. That's why chapter 20 is so important, because it's the only place where it gives the first resurrection a number before the word resurrection. And as we saw, first and second here, first resurrection is contrasted with the second death. So you've got to be a part of the first resurrection, which is spiritual, to be spared being subject to the second death. And so first and second here are terms of contrast, not sequence. You need to get that point clear. But then, beginning in verse 7, Satan is loosed from his restrictions. He's the one who leads the world to try and oppose the church, but he is judged. That judgment is pictured as fire coming down from heaven. In verse 9, he is cast into hell, where the beast and the false prophet are also cast. That happens simultaneously, because chapter 20, verses 9 and 10 correspond to chapter 19, the very end of that chapter. But then we see a different symbol, picture of the judgment as a court proceeding in verses 11 through 15. And so again, we're judged out of, ultimately, the book of life. The book of life shows who is his. But who is his is revealed by our lives. And that is important, because we should know that we are saved. And our life should reveal that, because God is giving us opportunities all the time in how we treat people, what we do with our money, what we do with our time, to show who we are really loyal to, so that when he comes again, there should be no question as to who we really belong to. It's kind of summarizing what John has been saying throughout this book. You're either a dweller on the earth or you're a citizen of heaven. You either worship the beast or you worship the Lamb. You either have the mark of the beast or the seal of God on you. It's one, you're either a member of the great city or the beloved city. And what this is saying is our life should reveal that there should be no question about our loyalties when it comes time to the judgment which will come about at Christ's second coming.